The lecture hall was alive with tension, not the nervous kind that usually accompanied exams or drills, but the simmering, instinctive unease that came from discussing creatures whose very existence could tear apart the strongest minds if underestimated, and the cadets, human and alien alike, were locked in a heated debate over predator hierarchies, each species arguing their own experience, knowledge, and biases as if the answer had been written in the stars for them to decipher, yet the human female at the center of it all remained quiet, her calm belying an undercurrent of deadly understanding as she listened to the shouts, the interjections, the bickering over which predator could dominate another in every conceivable scenario, from speed and strength to cunning and lethality, while the holoscreens flickered with combat simulations, displaying xenomorphic figures clashing with lethal precision. Their movements frozen in frame to highlight bone density, claw sharpness, musculature, and predatory instincts that were almost impossible to quantify across species, and as the aliens began throwing numbers, historical kill ratios, and hypothetical strategies at each other, her gaze didn't waver, though it carried a weight that made even veteran soldiers shift uncomfortably in their seats. And then, without warning, she spoke, cutting through the cacophony with a question so precise it was almost surgical. "Are we counting trained or wild ones?" Silence fell like a heavy shroud, the debate halting mid-sentence as the room absorbed the implication, because every cadet, every instructor, every species present understood immediately that the distinction wasn't trivial. Trained predators had been conditioned, guided, and sometimes enhanced by their handlers, their lethality calculated, disciplined, and predictable within limits, whereas wild predators, untamed, autonomous, and untethered, carried a chaos that no data model, no simulation, could fully anticipate, and her words exposed the blind spots in every argument previously presented, forcing the cadets to reconsider every statistic, every anecdote, and every historical record they had cited, while the AI assisting with the lecture began to recalculate, its processors churning as it tried to parse scenarios that had previously been treated as linear and predictable but were now layered with uncertainty and nuance, and the instructor, a grizzled veteran who had spent decades analyzing apex hunters in multiple galaxies, could only swallow hard, realizing that her own mental models were suddenly inadequate, because even the simulations could not replicate the instinctive adaptability of a wild predator confronted with intelligent opposition, and the human female leaned back slightly, arms crossed, eyes narrowing with the faintest hint of amusement, aware that she had just exposed both arrogance and ignorance in the room without raising her voice, her question rippling outward like a pebble in a calm pond, disturbing long-held assumptions and forcing every cadet to confront the uncomfortable truth that knowledge without context, without understanding the parameters of training versus instinct, was as dangerous as underestimating a predator in the field. And as murmurs began to ripple through the ranks, the alien cadets shifting uneasily in their armor, whispering to each other about packs, hunting methods, and previous encounters, she allowed herself a small, controlled smile, knowing that the real lesson was about to begin, not who was stronger, faster, or smarter, but who could think clearly when instinct and unpredictability were thrown into the calculus, because in the galaxy, underestimating wildness was a death sentence, and her one simple question had just ensured that everyone in that room was about to learn exactly why humans, though often dismissed as baseline species, had survived for so long amidst creatures designed to kill everything around them. The room remained suspended in a tense silence, every cadet processing the gravity of her question as the AI projected comparative data across the holoscreens, recalculating predator hierarchies in real time and now struggling to account for variables that had previously been considered negligible, and as the alien cadets whispered furiously to one another, citing historical hunts, genetic augmentations, and territorial dominance, she leaned forward slightly, her gaze calm but sharp, scanning each of them with the precision of someone who had not only studied predators but understood them on a level that transcended data points and kill ratios, while the instructor, normally commanding the room with unquestioned authority, found herself hesitating, realizing that her decades of field experience and classified reports suddenly seemed incomplete, inadequate, as though a hidden dimension of predatory behavior had just been revealed, and then she elaborated further, clarifying her question in a way that shifted the debate entirely. Because a trained predator is a weapon, yes, but a wild one is a force of nature, unpredictable, adaptive, and unbound by tactics we can foresee. Which do you value more in a confrontation? Raw instinct, or controlled lethality? The AI, its voice calm but layered with digital uncertainty, interjected. Scenario recalibration in progress. Predictive outcomes may be unreliable for wild specimens. And holographic models flickered, attempting to simulate attacks, ambush patterns, and behavioral responses of predators whose instincts had never been mapped fully, while the cadets realized in real time that everything they thought they knew about apex hierarchies, strength, speed, cunning, was dependent on context, on the environment, on whether the creatures had been trained, conditioned, or left to their own devices, and the atmosphere thickened with a mixture of awe and unease as the human female began outlining practical examples from historical encounters, describing situations where highly trained hunters had been outsmarted, overpowered, or psychologically manipulated by wild predators, instances where the raw unpredictability of instinctive behavior had turned the tide in battles previously thought impossible to lose. And the cadets absorbed each story with widening eyes, their own biases and species-specific assumptions slowly unraveling under the weight of logic paired with instinctive truth, while the instructor, now silent, realized that the lesson had transformed from theoretical classification into a profound meditation on the nature of power, adaptation, and survival, and as murmurs spread about which predators could be counted as controlled versus untamed, the female cadet allowed herself to stand taller, commanding the room not with authority but with clarity, forcing everyone present to confront the uncomfortable reality that in the galaxy, no measure of data, augmentation, or preparation could fully account for the chaos of nature, and that understanding the difference between a trained killer and a wild one was not just an academic exercise, it was a question of life, death, and the delicate balance of respect for forces beyond comprehension. Because only by acknowledging the untamed could one hope to survive encounters that had no precedent and no margin for error. The cadets could feel the shift in the room as the debate escalated from numbers and historical anecdotes into the realm of instinct and intuition, a subtle but undeniable tension settling over every being present, because the human female had just forced them to confront a truth that no simulation, no hollow projection, and no ancestral record could fully capture. Wild predators did not follow logic, rules, or the patterns expected by intelligent observers, and as she paced slowly along the front of the lecture hall, her eyes glinting with a mixture of calculation and awe, she began to illustrate the consequences of underestimating the untamed, recounting a scenario from a remote jungle world where a pack of trained hunters, genetically augmented and armed with the most advanced tracking and suppression tech, had been utterly defeated not by brute force but by the cunning and adaptability of creatures that had never been catalogued, observed, or theorized in any official database. And as her voice carried over the room, detailing the minute adjustments, split-second improvisations, and environmental exploitation the wild predators employed, the cadets could feel their preconceived notions unraveling, their mental models collapsing under the weight of experiential truth, and even the AI, designed to calculate outcomes with unerring precision, began to flicker as it attempted to reconcile probability with case, projecting multiple potential outcomes for every confrontation yet unable to provide a definitive ranking, while the instructor, normally the anchor of authority, realized that she had been silently clinging to outdated assumptions, and that the human's insight, calm, deliberate, and terrifyingly accurate, was a lesson in humility and survival rather than mere hierarchy, and as she asked pointed questions to challenge the cadets' reasoning, forcing them to consider terrain, predator psychology, and unpredictability, murmurs turned into hesitant debates, and the class began to grasp that trained and wild were not merely descriptors, but fundamentally different paradigms of danger, control, and adaptability, where one represented disciplined lethality and the other embodied a raw, instinctive, and inherently unknowable force, and by the time the hour had passed, the room had transformed from a battlefield of egos and species pride into a collective meditation on respect, caution, and the fragile arrogance of overconfidence, because, in that moment, Each cadet understood that knowledge without the wisdom to contextualize it against unpredictability was a liability, that every measure, stat, and simulation could be rendered meaningless by a single untamed instinct, and as she concluded with a subtle, almost imperceptible smile, the silence that followed was not empty, but charged with comprehension, fear, and the dawning realization that in the galaxy, survival was never just about skill or strength, it was about understanding the untamable, and acknowledging that the wild would always have the final word, no matter how disciplined or advanced the hunters thought themselves to be. The tension in the lecture hall reached a tangible peak as the cadets began to truly internalize the implications of her question, their eyes darting nervously between the holographic predator simulations and the human female who now seemed almost like a conductor orchestrating the chaotic symphony of data, instinct, and debate, and as she raised her hand to emphasize her next point, the AI projected a detailed comparison of dozens of apex predators from across the galaxy, some genetically enhanced, some cybernetically augmented, and some entirely wild, each displayed with kill ratios, attack patterns, and social behavior charts, yet for the first time, the data began to show cracks, inconsistencies that no algorithm could smooth over, because the human had introduced the variable that could not be quantified, instinct, unpredictability, and adaptive intelligence born of survival without guidance. And she leaned in slightly, her voice calm but edged with authority as she asked, "Consider the High-Wrath from the Tolarian Belt, highly trained in ambush protocols, yes, but how many of you accounted for the variations introduced by environmental stressors when a wild pack encounters unfamiliar terrain?" Heads nodded hesitantly, but the murmurs that followed revealed that even veteran cadets had not anticipated the depth of analysis required. Trained predators operated within defined parameters, predictable loops, and known reactions, but wild predators adapted, innovated, and exploited gaps in understanding that no one could anticipate fully, and as the AI attempted to simulate these encounters, it flickered, overloading on the sheer number of permutations, unable to render a single conclusive outcome, and the room fell silent as her words sank in. Survival was not just about strength, speed, or weaponry. It was about respecting the unknown, the chaotic force of life that could not be tamed or predicted, because one small miscalculation against the wild could mean total annihilation, whether in combat exercises or real encounters. And as she shifted her gaze to the cadets, challenging them to reconcile ego with reality, the alien students murmured in their own languages, debating the implications of wild versus trained hierarchies, while the human instructor realized that this was no longer a lesson in strategy but a masterclass in humility, awareness, and anticipation, and the female cadet concluded with a final, pointed statement that cut through every preconception. "Training can make a killer. Instinct makes a predator. And when the two collide, only respect and understanding determine who survives." A hush fell over the lecture hall, not born of fear, but of comprehension, the realization that for every formula, stat, or enhancement, the raw, untamed force of life remained the ultimate teacher, and that in the galaxy's vast tapestry, the wild would always be the final arbiter. And the cadets knew that the lesson she had delivered today would shape not only their understanding of predator hierarchies but their very approach to survival in a universe that was far stranger and more dangerous than they had ever been taught. As the discussion settled into a tense, contemplative silence, the cadets began to truly grasp the gravity of what had been revealed, the room vibrating with a mix of awe, fear, and newfound respect, because the human female's single question, "Are we counting trained or wild ones?" had upended every assumption, forcing them to see predators not as statistics or trophies but as living, unpredictable forces whose intelligence, adaptability, and raw instinct could render even the most advanced strategy irrelevant. And as she stepped slowly to the center of the hall, her presence commanding attention without a word, she elaborated further, weaving together historical accounts, field reports, and instinctive observations in a tapestry that no data model could replicate, showing how trained predators, while precise and deadly, were ultimately bound by patterns, while wild predators operated in a realm beyond predictability, their every movement a negotiation with survival itself, and the AI, now silent, seemed almost reverent in its pause, acknowledging that some variables could not be calculated, while the cadets absorbed each example, their previous pride and certainty melting into cautious understanding, and she emphasized the subtle yet critical differences. The patience of a trained predator versus the patience of a wild one, the calculated strike versus the opportunistic ambush, the learned aggression versus the instinctive drive to survive and dominate, and as she illustrated a hypothetical scenario in which both types confronted each other under extreme environmental stress, the room became a theater of tension, cadets imagining each move, counter, an unexpected reaction, their minds grappling with the chaos of unpredictability, while she concluded, her voice calm but resonant with authority. In the end, it is not enough to know who is stronger, faster, or smarter. True understanding comes from recognizing that wildness carries lessons no training can teach, that instinct can override experience, and that survival depends on respecting the unknown. And as the holoscreens dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of ambient lights, the cadets sat in stunned contemplation, realizing that the lesson was more than academic. It was philosophical, existential, a revelation of the delicate balance between control and chaos. And as whispers began to ripple through the hall, they understood that the question she had asked had not only redefined predator hierarchies but had also imparted a universal truth for life across the galaxy. That raw instinct and untamed force, when acknowledged and respected, could challenge even the most disciplined mind, and that in a universe where the wild always holds the final authority, humility, awareness, and respect are the only tools that ensure survival, leaving every cadet forever changed, their understanding of predators, and perhaps themselves, profoundly altered by a single, deceptively simple question.